They won't announce it on TV. There won't be a bell. There won't be an emergency press conference. There won't be a headline that says, "The petrodollar is dead." It doesn't die like that. It dies quietly, inside contracts, inside side deals, inside closed-door meetings between energy ministers and central bankers 6,000 miles away from you. It dies in the fine print of a trade agreement that nobody reads. It dies the moment oil starts flowing. And dollars don't. And when that happens, you don't see it on a chart first. You feel it in your rent, in your groceries, in your interest rate, in the sudden realization that America's 50-year free lunch just got canceled. This is the story of how the most powerful financial arrangement in modern history was born in secrecy, and how it died the same way. The day the dollar lost its anchor. To understand what just died, you have to go back to the moment the old system broke. For most of the 20th century, the dollar had a simple story. It was as good as gold. Foreign governments could bring their dollars to the US and exchange them for gold at a fixed rate. That was the deal. That was the promise. By the late 1960s, that promise was killing the empire. America had fought expensive wars, built massive welfare programs, and shipped dollars all over the world. Foreign central banks started doing the rational thing. They called the bluff. They asked for gold instead of paper. The gold began to drain from US vaults. The math stopped working. The illusion cracked. So in the early 1970s, the US did something no empire had done on that scale before. It quietly defaulted on the gold promise. Overnight, the world's reserve currency was no longer backed by anything you could hold in your hand. A global system built on gold for dollars suddenly became, trust us. And trust isn't a policy. It's a feeling. Feelings can change. The people running the system knew that. So while the public watched the headlines, something else was being built in the shadows. A new anchor for the dollar. Not gold this time. Oil. The secret that turned oil into a weapon. Here's the problem Washington had in the 1970s. They needed the world to keep using dollars. They no longer had gold to promise. They still wanted to run massive deficits, wage wars, and consume more than they produced, so they went shopping for a new deal. The logic was simple. If you can't back your currency with gold, back it with something the world must buy. Something every country, every company, every army needs: energy. Behind closed doors, American officials went to the one place that had what they needed: the oil kingdoms of the Middle East. The reported understanding was brutal in its simplicity. You price your oil only in US dollars. You recycle those dollars back into US assets, treasuries, stocks, real estate. In return, we protect your regime. We sell you weapons. We guarantee your security. You get tanks. We get demand. Oil would be sold in dollars. Countries that needed oil would need dollars first. Suddenly, if you wanted to keep the lights on, you needed US currency. The petrodollar was born. Most people never voted for this system. Most people never even heard the word. But it changed everything about how money, power, and energy flowed through the world. How a free lunch is engineered. Once the petrodollar took hold, something strange happened. America discovered it could do what no other country could do for long: run gigantic trade deficits and not blow up. Here's how the free lunch worked. 1. The US imports oil, electronics, clothes, cars, stuff from around the world. 2. It pays with something it can create for almost zero cost, dollars. 3. The exporters take those dollars and they can't really escape them. To buy oil, they need dollars. To store reserves, they choose dollars. To play safe, they buy US debt. The money leaves America and then comes back to America. Goods flow in, paper flows out, then flows back. The rest of the world sends real things: steel, copper, labor, time. America sends numbers on a screen that everyone has agreed to treat like oxygen. As long as oil was chained to the dollar, the game stayed locked. If you needed energy, you needed dollars. If you earned dollars, you parked them in US assets. If you parked them in US assets, Washington could borrow and spend without facing the normal punishment of a debtor nation. No hyperinflation, no currency crisis, no sudden collapse. The biggest debtor in human history kept living like the richest creditor. That's not a bug. That was the design. But every design has a breaking point, especially when the backing of your system isn't a metal in a vault, but a political arrangement in a desert. Cracks in the oil throne. The first cracks in the petrodollar didn't show up in policy papers. They showed up in blood. When countries tried to step outside the dollar energy system, they tended to discover that the free market of oil came with a very specific boundary. Try to sell oil in something other than dollars, and things got dangerous. Over time, more and more nations began asking a forbidden question. Why should we keep using the currency of a country that uses that currency as a weapon? Because that's what happened next. As the US grew comfortable in its role, it discovered another use for the petrodollar system. If the entire world needs your currency to buy energy, then cutting someone off from your currency is no longer just economic policy. It's a form of warfare. Sanctions, SWIFT exclusions, reserve freezes, entire economies locked out of the system overnight. On paper, it was about punishing bad actors. In practice, it was a warning to everyone else. You don't just use our currency, you obey the conditions attached to it. And quietly, far from the TV cameras, other powers started making a note. Build alternative payment systems. Build bilateral trade in local currencies. Build gold reserves. Build your own infrastructure for moving energy outside the dollar's reach. The petrodollar wasn't just a source of profits anymore, it was a source of risk. The rise of alternatives. History is not a series of sudden breaks. It's a slow drip, then a crack, then a flood. For the petrodollar, the slow drip looked like this. Countries signing oil deals in euros, yuan, or local currencies. Russia and China linking pipelines and payment systems. Asian and Middle Eastern energy producers launching futures contracts not settled in dollars. Central banks around the world quietly buying record amounts of gold, just as trust in U.S. fiscal discipline was collapsing. Every one of those moves was a tiny vote. Not a vote against the dollar today, but a vote against trusting it forever. The U.S. made that problem worse. The more Washington weaponized finance, the more it reminded the world of a dangerous truth. If all your reserves are held in someone else's currency, in someone else's banks, under someone else's legal system, they're not really your reserves. They're permissions, revocable permissions. So an alternative map began to form. Multiple currencies, bilateral energy deals. It does parallel plumbing for payments. Regional blocks that could, if necessary, cut the dollar out of the loop. The petrodollar didn't explode. It slowly lost its monopoly. And once a monopoly becomes one option among many, the magic starts to fade. The moment a system dies, a system like the petrodollar doesn't die the day the last oil cargo is priced in dollars. It dies the day enough key players decide we no longer trust the dollar to be the neutral middleman of energy. You don't need 100% of oil to move away from dollars. You just need enough volume priced elsewhere that the old rule, dollars or nothing, no longer applies. Once that mental line is crossed, something irreversible happens. Energy-rich nations realize they don't have to lend their surpluses to the U.S. anymore. Importing nations realize they don't have to beg for dollars to keep the lights on. Major powers realize they can design systems where Washington is not invited. The machine doesn't collapse overnight. Ships still move. Contracts still exist. But the direction of travel changes. For 50 years, the gravitational pull was oil, dollars, U.S. debt. Now it's more like oil, many currencies, many assets. The dollar hasn't disappeared. It just lost the guaranteed demand that came from being the only ticket into the energy market. And that, for America, is the difference between being a rich, powerful nation and having an empire-scale free lunch. What happens when the lunch bill arrives? So what does it actually mean when the petrodollar era ends? It doesn't mean gasoline disappears overnight. It doesn't mean the U.S. suddenly becomes a poor country. It means something much more subtle, but much more dangerous. For decades, the U.S. government could run giant deficits, export inflation, borrow at low rates, consume more than it produced. Because the rest of the world had to absorb U.S. debt as the price of participating in global trade. If that automatic demand fades, the math behind the empire changes. To attract the same amount of foreign money, the U.S. has to offer higher interest rates, cheaper assets, or more political pressure. Higher interest rates stress everything built during the era of cheap money. Zombie companies, over-leveraged households, speculative bubbles in stocks and real estate. Cheaper assets mean the wealth. Americans thought they had in stocks, and houses can evaporate quickly. Less foreign buying of debt means the government has to choose between painful fiscal discipline or printing the difference and letting the currency take the hit. You don't get to outsource your inflation forever. At some point, it comes home. The free lunch is replaced by a very real bill. History's warning. When reserve currencies retire. We've seen this movie before, just with different costumes. Before the dollar, it was the British pound that played this role. The British Empire dominated global trade. Its currency was used to settle deals between other countries. Its debt was considered risk-free. The empire financed wars, railways, colonies, often by issuing paper to the rest of the world, which was happy to hold the pound as savings. Then the costs mounted, debts piled up. 2 world wars later, Britain was exhausted financially and demographically. The pound didn't vanish in a day. It slowly lost its central role. New institutions were created, new power centers emerged, new negotiations decided the next reserve currency. The result was the world you've been living in, dollar at the center, everyone else orbiting it. Reserve currencies don't die because of one policy mistake. They die because the structure that supports them changes. The empire behind them weakens. The trade patterns change. The trust erodes. Alternatives appear. The death is always disguised as gradual transition, until suddenly it isn't. The psychological break. The petrodollar's real power was never just about contracts. It was about belief. Belief that dollars were neutral. Belief that U.S. debt was the safest asset. Belief that oil would always be traded the same way. For 50 years, that belief let America do something extraordinary, pay for real resources with promises, and roll those promises forward indefinitely. When that belief cracks, everyone behaves differently. Exporters ask for harder assets or diversified currencies. Importers negotiate alternative terms to avoid being hostage to one central bank. Investors wonder if risk-free truly means what it used to mean. The system can still function for a long time in that state, but it's no longer stable. It's no longer automatic. It's no longer a default. It's a negotiation. And history is very clear about how negotiations end when an empire's debts are too big, its promises too heavy, and its currency no longer blessed with unquestioned demand. Someone pays. The question is never, will there be a cost? The question is, who absorbs it? Savers through inflation? Taxpayers through austerity? Creditors through defaults? Or the empire itself through a slow loss of status and influence? Living in the aftermath. So what does the petrodollar just died really mean for a normal person, sitting in a normal house, watching all of this as numbers on a screen? It means the background assumptions of your entire life are shifting. The assumption that the dollar will always buy what it bought before. The assumption that your government can always find the money. The assumption that empires don't have to live under the same constraints as everyone else. As energy is increasingly traded outside the dollar's shadow, the U.S. starts facing the same basic reality other countries have always faced. If you want things from the world, you have to pay with something the world actually values. Production, technology, resources, real competitiveness. You can't just print your way to comfort while exporting the pain eternally. For 50 years, Americans lived inside a financial illusion so big it looked like normal life. That's what's ending. Not because of a law, not because of a speech, because the underlying bargain of the petrodollar era has quietly been renegotiated by countries that are tired of being at the mercy of one currency, one central bank, one set of political decisions they don't control. The funeral for that system has no cameras, no eulogies, no moment of silence. It's just a slow rerouting of tankers, contracts, and capital flows. By the time most people realize what happened, it will already be history. The petrodollar gave America a 50-year free lunch. Whatever comes next, you'll be paying full price.